Welcome back. This is day 5 of JavaScript Fundamentals, and today we're going to talk about scope. Now, scope is an extremely important topic in JavaScript because it determines what pieces of code can access other pieces of code. Scope can be divided into an almost limitless amount of levels. The topmost level is called the global scope, and as its name implies, the global scope is globally accessible. So any variable or function that we define in the global scope can be accessed anywhere within not only our code, but in any code that we bring in from a third party. And the global scope is the default scope, so every variable and function that we've created so far throughout this course have been global. And in fact, the alert function is also global. So to help you understand the global scope, let's take a look at some code that I've already prepared. We have a variable called global var. As its name implies, this is a global variable, and it's global because it's defined outside of any function. So that's how we create a global variable or function. We simply define it outside of another function. Although we don't really want to do that, and I'll explain why we don't want to do that later. Next, we have a function called global function. I'm really original with these names, aren't I? It's defined outside of another function, so it too is global. And the function first calls the alert function. Now, earlier I said that the alert function is global. So since it is global, we can access it from inside of a function, just like we're doing here. The same with the global var variable. Since it's global, we can use it inside of any other function. So we are getting the value of global var and displaying that within an alert window. And then in the next line, we are modifying that value. So we can get the value and we can also set a new value of a global variable because it is global. So first we execute this function. It's going to alert the original value of global var. We'll change the value of global var, and then we will alert the new value of global var. So let's go ahead and run this within the browser just so that you can see it work. Here we have the first alert. It says this is a global variable, and then whenever I click the OK button, the next line of code is going to execute, which will change the value of that global variable, and then we will display the new value. And there we go, value has been modified. So global variables and functions can be accessed from anywhere, but there's another type of scope called functional or local scope that we can define a variable or function inside of another function, and they cannot be accessed outside of that containing function. So they are local to the function that they are defined in. So as an example, let's add a new variable inside of the global function. So we'll use var, and then we'll call this local var, and we'll say this is a local variable. Let's change this call to alert to display the value contained within local var, and then let's try to access this variable from outside of the function. So let's do that down there. Let's also line up these two lines of code to make this all pretty. And let's refresh our browser. We will see the first alert, which is fine. We are inside of the global function right now, so we are alerting the value of the local variable. And then whenever we click OK, nothing happens. Well, let's look at the console. And once again, if you're on Windows and you're using Chrome, that is Control-Shift-I, and then you can press Escape to look at the console, or you can just press Control-Shift-J, and then that will take you there. For Apple users, you will want to go to the wrench menu, go to Tools, and JavaScript Console, and that will take you to the same place. Okay, so the error that we've gotten is that local var is not defined, and we're seeing that on line 11. So if we look at line 11, we can see that we are trying to alert the value of local var, but it's not defined because it is a local variable to the global function. So outside of this function, we cannot access it, but inside of the function, that's where this variable lives. And the same thing is true for parameters. So let's add param1. We'll do that again. Let's pass a value to the function. We'll do that. Let's alert param1, and then let's try to access that from outside. We'll go back, refresh. We get the value of 2 because that's what we passed to the function, but then we're going to get another error again because param1 is not defined. It is local to the global function. Well, we've used variables a lot so far, so let's confuse things just a little bit and use functions. It might seem weird at first, but you can actually define a function inside of another function. So let's do that. Let's call this function local function. And I'm going to use function expression syntax. By the way, I'm going to use function expressions from now on. The reason being because it explicitly shows you that functions are values. So you can use function declaration syntax if you want. I'm just going to use function expressions. So inside of local function, let's create a variable called superlocalvar. And let's give it a value of hello world. And then let's alert that value. Let's also try to access that superlocal var within the scope of global function. Because we know we can access it inside of local function, let's try to access it from within global. So let's do alert superlocal var. We also need to call the local function first. So let's call local function. And let's try to access superlocal var on line 15. Let's get rid of the parameter just so that all we have inside of global function is our local function. And let's go to the browser, refresh. We see hello world. That's exactly as we should see. So right now we are inside of the local function. If I click OK, we are going to get an error on line 11. So let's look at 11. That is this line here where we are trying to access superlocal var inside of global function, but this is a local variable to the local function. So even inside of global function, we cannot access a variable defined inside of another function. And that's why I said earlier that we can almost have a limitless amount of levels of scope. We can define a function inside of another function that would be defined inside of yet another function. We can keep defining functions inside of other functions, which, by the way, is called nesting functions. And each of these nested functions would have its own local scope. And just as global function has access to anything defined in the global scope, such as global var, local function has access to the global scope as well as anything defined inside of global function, because local function is defined within the scope of global function. So let's recreate the local var. So local var equals, this is a local variable. Let's also recreate the parameter, because parameters are special variables. Let's pass a value to it. Let's get rid of all the other alerts. And then just inside of local function, let's alert local var. And then let's alert param1 and alert global var. So let's go back, refresh. We have hello world, that is superlocal var inside of local function. Then we have, this is a local variable, which is local var defined inside of global function. We have 2, which is param1 of global function. And then we have, this is a global variable, which is the global variable defined in line 1. So you can think of a function's curly braces as a one-way boundary. Nothing defined outside of the curly braces can see inside of the curly braces. But from inside of the curly braces, you can see outside of the curly braces. So it's a little discriminatory in that way, but that's just how it's designed, and really, we wouldn't want it any other way. Alright, well there's one more thing we need to discuss and then I'll let you go for the day. We need to talk about identifier lookup. The word identifier is a fancy way of saying the word name. So instead of saying the variable's name is global var, you would say the variable identifier is global var. When you reference an identifier in your code, the JavaScript engine begins a process called identifier lookup. It's trying to find a variable or a function that has the same identifier. So when we use the global var variable in our code, the JavaScript engine has to look up its identifier in order to get or set its value. And it begins that search at whatever level of scope we're at, and then it moves up what's called the scope chain until it finds a matching identifier. So for example, we use the global var variable inside of local function. So the JavaScript engine is going to look within the scope of local function for global var. It's not defined inside of local function, so it's going to go to the next level of scope. It's going to go to the next link in the scope chain, which is global function. So it's going to look for the identifier there, but global var is not defined inside of global function, so it's going to go to the next level of scope, which is the global scope. And that's where it will find the global var identifier. So it will find that match, and then it will get its value so that it can be displayed within an alert window. Well, let's look at another example. Let's do alert foo. Now, we haven't defined foo anywhere, but I want you to see what the JavaScript engine is going to do. So we've used foo. The JavaScript engine is going to look in the scope of a local function to find the foo identifier. It's not going to find one, so it's going to go to the next link in the chain. And the reason why global function is the next link in the scope chain is because local function is defined inside of global function, so it's moving up to the next level. So global function is looked for, or it's looked in for the foo identifier. It doesn't find it, so then it moves to the global scope. Well, the engine isn't going to find the foo identifier there either. And the global scope is the topmost level of scope. You can't go above global. So since it can't find a global variable called foo, it's going to throw an error and say that foo is undefined. Because the JavaScript engine goes through this identifier lookup process, we can override an identifier by defining it in a lower level of scope. So for example, let's define a new variable inside of local function. Let's call this local var, and let's give it a value of hello world. Let's alert local var. And then in global function, let's alert global or local var as well. Now, whenever we execute this code, local function is going to execute. And then it's going to create a local var variable inside of local function. And then we use this variable inside of the function. So as far as JavaScript is concerned, whenever it does this identifier lookup process, it's going to look for the local var identifier and find it in the local function. So it's going to get the value of hello world. So whenever local function is finished executing, this version of local var is gone because it's local to local function. We haven't changed the value of the local var defined inside of global function. So whenever line 13 executes, it's still going to say this is a local variable. So let's go to the browser, refresh, and we will see hello world, and then we will see this is a local variable. And this is all because of how JavaScript looks up the identifier whenever we use it. We have overridden local var within local function. So inside of this function, anytime we use local var, it's going to use this local version of it. And then whenever we exit local function, then we use the local var defined within global function. While it's a pretty cool feature of JavaScript to override an identifier, I recommend that you do so sparingly. There are times when it makes sense to override an identifier to use a different value within a certain level of scope, but you'll typically want to stay away from this functionality because it can introduce bugs as well as make your code a little less clear. So with that, we'll call today's lesson done. Have a great one.